Across the vast lands of Eurasia, the connection between great farming civilizations and distant regions did not happen in isolation. Mobile communities, especially pastoral nomads, played a crucial role in linking these worlds together. Long before large empires reached their peak, some human groups discovered that survival did not depend only on crops. By raising animals such as sheep, cattle, goats, camels, and horses, they created a new way of life centered on movement, adaptation, and the careful use of natural resources. These communities relied mainly on their herds, shaping an existence that was flexible and deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. Unlike settled farmers who built cities and complex social systems, pastoral nomads moved across wide landscapes. Their way of life was usually semi-nomadic or fully nomadic, meaning they did not establish permanent urban centers. Yet their importance was enormous. For thousands of years, they interacted with nearly every major civilization across Eurasia. Through trade, conflict, and migration, they influenced how history developed across this massive region. After the earliest farming societies began to appear around 8000 BCE, many communities chose a settled agricultural life. However, not everyone followed this path. Some groups continued hunting and gathering, while others adopted a mixed lifestyle that combined elements of farming and herding. These pastoral communities often practiced small-scale agriculture when conditions allowed, but their main focus remained on livestock. This choice was not accidental. It was a deliberate adaptation to environments where farming alone could not provide stability. Pastoralism did not emerge immediately with early agriculture. It developed later when people learned new ways to benefit from animals without killing them. Instead of relying only on meat, they began using milk, wool, and even the strength of animals for pulling tools and transport. Over time, they also learned to ride horses, which transformed their mobility. This shift allowed them to travel further, control larger territories, and survive in regions that were unsuitable for farming. With these innovations, pastoral nomadism became a fully developed and sustainable way of life. The environment where these communities lived shaped everything about them. The Eurasian steppe, a vast belt of grassland stretching thousands of kilometers from Eastern Europe to East Asia, was central to their existence. This land could not support large-scale agriculture, but it provided endless grazing grounds for animals. Humans could not eat grass, but their animals could, turning an otherwise unusable resource into food, clothing, and energy. This unique relationship between land, animals, and people defined the steppe world. Life on the steppe required constant movement. To prevent overgrazing, families traveled with their herds, shifting locations with the seasons. Their diet depended heavily on animal products such as milk, cheese, and fermented drinks, along with meat and occasional hunting. Every animal was valuable, not only as food but also as wealth. Herds represented survival, status, and economic power. Because of this, they had to be carefully managed and protected. Despite their independence, pastoral nomads were never completely self-sufficient. They depended on farming societies for goods they could not produce, such as grain, tools, weapons, and luxury items. This created a constant relationship between nomads and settled civilizations. Sometimes this relationship was peaceful, based on trade. At other times, it turned into conflict with raids and warfare. Over time, this interaction formed a complex and often tense balance between mobility and settlement. Their social structure reflected their lifestyle. Living in small groups, each member of the community had an important role. Men, women, and children all contributed to daily survival, especially in managing herds and producing food. This often led to a more balanced and less rigid social system compared to hierarchical farming societies. Their homes were designed for movement, portable, round tents made of wood and felt, easy to assemble and transport. When necessary, entire communities could relocate quickly, covering large distances in search of better conditions. As populations grew and environmental conditions changed, these nomadic groups began to move more frequently and over longer distances. Archaeological evidence, such as burial mounds, scattered across the steppe, shows patterns of expansion and migration. These movements were not random. They were often driven by climate changes, resource pressure, or competition between groups. Periods of stability were sometimes followed by sudden waves of migration that reshaped entire regions. These migrations had a lasting impact, especially through the spread of languages. Many of the nomadic groups who moved across Eurasia spoke early forms of Indo-European languages. As they expanded into new territories, their languages spread with them, often replacing older ones. Over time, this process led to the development of one of the largest language families in the world, still spoken by millions today. The steppe was never a barrier, but a bridge. Rivers, mountains, and deserts that might have stopped other societies did not limit these mobile communities. Instead, they adapted and used these features to their advantage. Their ability to move quickly and survive in harsh conditions gave them a unique power. By the early first millennium BCE, some nomadic groups had become highly skilled warriors, especially with the use of horses and advanced weapons like composite bows. These mounted fighters were fast, flexible, and difficult to defeat. Eventually, even powerful agricultural states had to adapt to this new reality. Armies changed their tactics to deal with nomadic warfare. In some cases, nomadic groups grew strong enough to form large political structures, sometimes described as steppe empires. These were not traditional states, but they had leadership, organization, and military strength capable of challenging even the greatest civilizations of their time. Even the largest confederations created by pastoral peoples were fundamentally different from the great settled civilizations that rose across Eurasia. They could be vast, disciplined, and militarily powerful, yet they did not develop in the same way as the agricultural empires of China, Iran, India, or the Mediterranean. They did not build large urban centers filled with dense populations. They left behind little monumental architecture apart from elite burial sites, and in most cases they did not rely on writing as settled states did. Even so, these nomadic unions proved that highly mobile societies could organize themselves on a large scale, rule enormous territories, and remain durable over long periods of time. Their movements and networks helped connect the many different peoples, economies, and cultures of Inner Eurasia with the major agrarian states around them. Their military organization, especially their mastery of mounted warfare, allowed many of them to dominate the steppe and become serious rivals to the armies of settled empires. At the center of this transformation stood the animal that made militarized nomadism truly possible: the horse. To understand why the horse mattered so much, it helps to step back from political history and look at the much older natural story behind it. Human history did not unfold separately from the environment. Geography, climate, and biology shaped the world in which states expanded. Merchants traveled, and armies fought. Some of the most important creatures in Eurasian history were not human at all. Silkworms, camels, and horses each played their own role in opening routes, carrying goods, and supporting entire ways of life. Among them, the horse stands out as one of the most influential animals ever known, and its long evolution helps explain why it became so central to life on the steppe. Pastoral peoples depended on only a limited range of animals. Sheep, goats, and cattle had become useful to human communities very early, and camels later became essential in dry lands, stretching from North Africa to Inner Asia. In desert environments, the camel made long-distance survival and transport possible, and in time it would become indispensable in caravan trade. But for the peoples of the steppe, no domesticated animal changed the balance of power more dramatically than the horse. It was the horse that gave mobile warriors speed, endurance, and striking power across great distances. Because of this, the story of horse domestication is inseparable from the rise of the great nomadic confederations. The horse itself came from an extremely ancient line. Its distant ancestors appeared tens of millions of years ago as small browsing mammals, far removed in form from the powerful riding animal known today. Over immense stretches of time, these early creatures changed in response to new environments. Their bodies grew taller, their legs became longer and better suited to speed, and their skulls and teeth gradually adapted to different kinds of food. These changes did not happen suddenly. They unfolded across countless generations, shaped by the spread of grasslands and the pressures of survival. One of the most important developments in this long process was the adaptation to grazing. Earlier ancestors of the horse had fed mainly on softer vegetation. But as grasslands expanded, some forms evolved teeth capable of handling coarse grasses. This was a major turning point. It meant that the horse lineage became suited to open plains rather than woodland environments. Later, forms looked increasingly similar to modern horses, with stronger limbs designed for fast running and more efficient movement over wide landscapes. Eventually, the genus that includes horses, asses, and zebras emerged and spread successfully across large parts of the world. Wild horses flourished across Eurasia for thousands of years, even after they vanished from the Americas. At some point in the 5th millennium BCE, human communities on the steppe began the long and difficult process of domesticating them. Exactly how this happened is still uncertain. There may not have been a single place where it began. Different groups may have domesticated local horse populations in different regions, while others may have adopted the practice from neighbouring peoples and blended wild and domestic herds over time. What is clear is that horse domestication was not a small development. It was a major turning point in the human use of energy and movement. A domesticated horse could carry a rider, pull weight, travel far, and respond to training in ways that transform both everyday life and warfare. Few animals have altered the course of history so deeply. The horse extended human mobility beyond anything previously possible on land. It allowed steppe communities to control broader territories, react quickly to threats, and attack with a speed that settled states often struggled to match. Among militarized nomads, horses were valued not only as practical assets, but also as symbols of status, power, and spiritual meaning. They were bound closely to identity, warfare, and prestige. Entire cultures measured strength, wealth, and freedom through their relationship with horses, and this bond became one of the defining features of life across the Eurasian steppe. The rise of mounted nomadic warfare depended on more than the horse alone, but without the horse it could not have happened. By the early 1st millennium BCE, highly mobile warrior societies had emerged across the steppe. Their speed and flexibility gave them major advantages over many sedentary armies. Later, people such as the Huns and the Mongols would become famous examples of this kind of power, but they belonged to a much longer tradition. Long before them, mounted nomadic groups had already become decisive actors in Eurasian history, raiding, trading, migrating, and at times ruling over large populations and territories. Several conditions helped produce these militarized societies. Climate shifts, population pressures, and growing competition for grazing land all pushed nomadic communities toward more organized forms of conflict. Contact with settled civilizations also intensified, especially through trade and border disputes. At the same time, military technology improved. one innovation in particular proved revolutionary: the composite bow. This weapon greatly increased the striking power of mounted warriors and helped create the classic image of the steppe archer. The composite bow was a carefully engineered weapon made by combining different materials into a single, highly efficient form. Wood formed its core, while horn and sinew were added in layers to increase stored energy when the bow was drawn. This design made it far more powerful than a simple wooden bow of similar size. It could deliver strong, accurate shots from horseback, and that gave steppe warriors a deadly advantage. In the dry conditions of inner Eurasia, it worked especially well. In wetter climates, the glue holding it together could weaken, but on the open steppe it became one of the most effective weapons of the ancient world. Still, technology alone does not explain the success of mounted nomads. Their warriors were shaped from childhood by a harsh and demanding environment. Riding, hunting, endurance, and discipline were part of daily life long before battle began. Large-scale hunts served not only as a means of survival, but also as training grounds that sharpened coordination, obedience, and tactical movement. These communities learned how to live lightly, move quickly, and fight without depending on long supply lines. A mounted unit could travel fast, adapt to changing conditions, and strike with precision. Their forces often used bows, but they also fought effectively with swords, axes, spears, and maces. Skilled commanders relied on reconnaissance, surprise, and psychological pressure as much as brute strength. Yet the importance of pastoral nomads was never limited to warfare. Their mobility and their need for goods unavailable on the steppe made them essential intermediaries between distant worlds. They moved through deserts, grasslands, and mountain corridors that were difficult for settled peoples to control. In doing so, they linked different societies across inner Eurasia, carrying goods, ideas, animals, and information between them. They could raid settled neighbours, but they could also trade with them, escort caravans, and help sustain long-distance exchange. Their role in connecting regions was one of the key reasons why wider trans-Eurasian networks became possible. Among the most important nomadic powers on the borders of ancient China were the Xiongnu and the Yuezhi. Both played a major role in the early history of Eurasian exchange. Both were neighbours of the Han world and of earlier Chinese states, and both belong to the broader story of how the steppe shaped imperial history. The Xiongnu appear in early Chinese accounts as a highly mobile people who moved with large herds of horses, sheep, cattle, goats, and camels, ranging from grasslands into harsher frontier zones. They were feared as mounted archers whose bows could drive arrows through armour, and they also fought with spears and swords when needed. At the same time, archaeology shows that the Xiongnu were not simply wandering raiders. Some of their communities practiced farming, built permanent dwellings, and lived in fortified settlements. Excavations have revealed skilled craft production, including textiles, leatherwork, and fine metal objects. Evidence from older sites also suggests that communities linked to the ancestors of the Xiongnu had interacted with Chinese states for many centuries. This makes it clear that steppe societies were more varied than many written accounts suggest. They could shift between mobility and settlement depending on conditions, and their economies were often more complex than outsiders assumed. The Xiongnu reached their greatest strength under a ruler named Modu, who turned them into one of the most formidable powers in inner Eurasia. Under his leadership, the Confederation expanded rapidly and developed a reputation for discipline, cunning, and military efficiency. Steppe warfare under leaders like Modu relied on speed, surprise, feigned retreats, and relentless pressure on weakened enemies. According to later accounts, Modu's rise was marked by ruthless determination. After surviving a dangerous political struggle within his own family, he took control and eliminated rivals, then used his new authority to unite and expand the Xiongnu world. Once established, he pushed outward, subduing neighbouring groups and confronting the Han state as an equal power rather than a frontier nuisance. Among the strongest of the peoples facing the Xiongnu were the Yuezhi. Their ancestors likely belonged to earlier waves of pastoral migration that had carried Indo-European speaking groups across Inner Asia over many centuries. By the time they appear clearly in historical memory, they had become wealthy and influential through horse breeding, long-distance trade, and military power. Their main centre lay in the corridor regions of western China, where mountain-fed oases created pockets of life and exchange. Ancient accounts describe them as commanding a large mounted force, and before the rise of Modu, they seem to have regarded the Xiongnu as a lesser rival. The westward movement of the Yuezhi changed the history of Inner Eurasia in ways far greater than a simple tribal migration might suggest. Its long-term importance is most visible in the rise of the Kushan Empire, which would later become one of the dominant imperial powers of Eurasia. But the migration itself also transformed the political balance of Central Asia as the Yuezhi passed through lands already occupied by other peoples. Their arrival set off a chain reaction. Communities already living along these routes were pushed, displaced, or drawn into conflict, and among the groups most deeply affected were the Saka. As pressure spread outward, different branches of the Saka were forced into major migrations of their own. Some moved south through the western Tarim Basin, crossed the high mountain routes through the Karakoram, and eventually settled in Kashmir. Others entered Bactria and remained for a time in the region later known as Sakistan before being pushed still farther southeast, into the upper Indus Valley and the Punjab. There, they founded powerful kingdoms that became influential enough to shape the historical calendar of early India. The Yuezhi themselves left their old homeland around the middle of the 2nd century BCE and first moved northwest into the Ili River Valley. This was a fertile and attractive region, rich enough to support both agriculture and seasonal herding, and it offered the migrants a temporary sense of security after the trauma of defeat. For several decades they remained there, building a new life in the lands around Issyk Kul. Some communities likely turned more toward farming, while others continued the mixed pastoral rhythms that had long defined their economy. Their ruling house probably drew wealth from tribute as well as from control over nearby settled populations. For a time, the Yuezhi may have believed that distance had finally shielded them from the enemies who had driven them from their former home. That calm did not last. Old rivals had not forgotten them. Around the 130s BCE, a strong mounted force made up of Wusun and Xiongnu warriors struck the region and shattered Yuezhi control there. The defeat forced the Yuezhi to move once again, beginning the second and more dramatic phase of their migration. This time, they pushed far deeper into Central Asia, passing through fertile zones, such as the Fergana Valley, and neighbouring territories farther west. Their journey eventually brought them into the great riverlands that drained toward the Amu Darya, one of the most important waterways of Inner Asia. In this region, where roots, resources and civilizations met, the Yuezhi finally found a place where they could stop and rebuild their power. Soon after arriving, they faced resistance from Sakar groups already established there. The Yuezhi defeated them and seized control of the land south of the Amu Darya, including the wealthy region of Bactria. This was no ordinary conquest. Bactria had long been one of the great crossroads of the ancient world, shaped by Persian rule, the campaigns of Alexander, and the legacy of the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed him. By taking this territory, the Yuezhi did far more than capture a new homeland. They inserted themselves directly into one of the richest and most strategically important regions in Eurasia. The kingdom they overran had already been weakened by earlier attacks and could not withstand the pressure of a powerful mounted confederation. The result was a striking example of pastoral warriors taking control of a prosperous settled society. After the conquest, the Yuezhi did not destroy the existing order so much as take command of it. Like many steppe conquerors, they found it more useful to rule through local elites than to replace every structure from below. Existing rulers were often left in place under Yuezhi authority, and urban life continued. Markets remained active, especially in the great cities of Bactria, and this exposed the Yuezhi more directly to the advantages of commerce, taxation, and long-distance exchange. In earlier generations, they had been known above all as a mobile confederation of horse-breeding and war-making pastoralists. Now, they stood over a land of fields, towns, merchants, and fortified centres. Their relationship with wealth began to change. Trade was no longer only something conducted at the edge of nomadic life. It became part of the foundation of their new power. By the early decades after their arrival, the Yuezhi were securely established in Bactria. They occupied defensible territory, commanded productive farmland, collected tribute, and benefited from the commercial energy of one of Eurasia's most connected regions. Bactria had long stood at the meeting point of Iran, India, Central Asia, and the lands farther east, and the Yuezhi were now in possession of that strategic hinge. For the first time since their expulsion from Gansu, they were no longer simply survivors searching for refuge. They had become masters of a region whose geography offered enormous possibilities. Out of this position would eventually emerge the Kushan Empire, one of the great political powers of its age and one of the key states in the rise of early transcontinental exchange. The larger meaning of this story reaches beyond the Yuezhi alone. Their migration shows how mobile confederations could reshape the map of Eurasia without building the same kind of civilization as agrarian empires. Nomadic power rarely expressed itself in stone cities, monumental architecture, or large written bureaucracies. Yet these confederations could still dominate huge spaces, direct the movement of other peoples, and alter the fate of entire regions. Their military strength, especially their mounted forces, made them dangerous rivals to settled states. At the same time, their control of routes across the steppe turned them into connectors between distant civilizations. They could be raiders, conquerors, escorts, brokers, or tributary overlords depending on the moment. But in every case, they shaped the flow of goods and influence across inner Eurasia. Behind this military and political transformation stood one of the most important animals in human history: the horse. The horse gave steppe peoples speed, endurance, and range on a scale unmatched by foot armies or slower wagon transport. It allowed mounted confederations to dominate open landscapes, strike at long distances, and maintain cohesion across vast territories. The horse had an ancient biological history stretching back millions of years, evolving through many earlier forms before becoming the animal that later spread across Eurasia. Its domestication was one of the great turning points in human history. Once people learned to breed, ride, and control horses effectively, the balance of power in many frontier regions changed forever. For pastoral warriors, the horse was not only useful, but central to their entire world. It provided mobility in war, movement in migration, prestige in society, and often spiritual meaning in ritual life. The rise of militarized nomadism depended on this bond. By the early first millennium BCE, mounted peoples of the steppe had developed a style of warfare that relied on speed, constant motion, and disciplined archery from horseback. Their composite bows added even greater striking force. Built from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, these bows stored tremendous energy and were especially effective in the dry climates of Inner Asia. In the hands of riders trained from childhood, they became devastating weapons. Still, the success of steppe warfare did not come from horses and bows alone. it was also the product of discipline, training, and a hard environment that rewarded endurance. Hunting across wide grasslands served as preparation for war. Riders learned to move in formation, survive with minimal baggage, and attack with flexibility rather than static force. Their armies were often lightly equipped and highly independent, capable of operating without the heavy supply systems that slowed settled empires. They used surprise, feigned retreat, rapid encirclement, and relentless pressure to wear down opponents. Many agrarian armies found such methods difficult to counter, especially in open country. Yet even as these mobile powers could be terrifying enemies, they were also essential to the growth of long-distance exchange. The peoples of the steppe occupied the spaces between settled civilizations. Because they moved across these spaces with ease, they carried not just weapons, but information, techniques, animals, and goods. Their need for grain, cloth, metalwork, and luxury products tied them to farmers and city dwellers. In return, they supplied horses, animal products, and access to routes that others could not easily control. They were therefore not simply destroyers at the edges of civilization. They were also intermediaries, linking worlds that might otherwise have remained far more isolated from one another. Among the steppe powers nearest ancient China, none were more important in this early period than the Xiongnu and the Yuezhi. Both were major neighbors of the Han world, and both helped shape the conditions from which the Silk Roads would emerge. Early Chinese descriptions present the Xiongnu as a highly mobile people, moving with great herds of horses, sheep, cattle, goats, and camels. They ranged across grasslands and desert margins, and in war they were famous as mounted archers, whose arrows could punch through armor. At the same time, archaeology has shown that life among them was more varied than older descriptions suggest. Some Xiongnu communities farmed, built permanent dwellings, and lived in fortified settlements. Their world was not made up of endless wandering alone, but of flexible strategies that shifted between movement and settlement as circumstances demanded. The Xiongnu reached the height of their power under Modu, a ruler of exceptional energy and ruthlessness. Under him, the Confederation expanded dramatically and forged a reputation for military discipline, cunning, and aggressive leadership. Mounted warfare under the Xiongnu relied on speed, sudden attacks, deceptive retreats, and constant harassment of weaker opponents. Modu's rise to power was remembered as a harsh struggle shaped by family rivalry, survival, and calculated violence. Once he seized control, he turned his authority outward, bringing neighboring peoples under Xiongnu dominance and confronting the Han state from a position of strength rather than weakness. The Yuezhi had once been one of the strongest peoples in that frontier world. Their roots lay in the wider waves of steppe migration that had earlier carried Indo-European-speaking pastoralists across Inner Asia. Over time, they became wealthy through horses, trade, and military power, and their position in the Gansu corridor gave them access to one of the major routes between the Chinese world and Central Asia. Before the rise of Modu, they had treated the Xiongnu with contempt, but once Xiongnu pressure intensified, that balance collapsed. Raids became more destructive, defeats more severe, and finally the Yuezhi leadership had no choice but to abandon its homeland and move westward. That decision changed the history of Eurasia. The Yuezhi migration displaced other peoples, redrew the political map of Central Asia, and eventually produced a new imperial formation in Bactria. It also set the stage for one of the most important diplomatic encounters in ancient history. Not long after the Yuezhi had secured themselves in Central Asia, a Han envoy named Zhang Qian arrived in the region after his own remarkable journey from China. His mission revealed to the Han court that beyond the steppe and desert barriers lay a wider world of powerful kingdoms, rich lands, and long-distance opportunities. That discovery would become one of the turning points in early Eurasian history. To understand why this mattered so much, the story must now shift eastward toward the rise of early Chinese civilization itself. The great exchange networks of Eurasia did not depend on nomadic movements alone. They also required large agrarian states, capable of imposing order, building roads, organizing labor, and sustaining trade across wide territories. In East Asia, that process began long before the Han. It was shaped first by geography. Mainland East Asia developed in a landscape marked by eastern river plains, northern grasslands, southern hills, and a vast mountainous and arid west. These regions influenced the ways communities farmed, fought, migrated, and governed. The eastern river plains formed the heartland of early Chinese civilization. Built by the great river systems of the Yellow River and the Yangtze, these alluvial lowlands provided fertile soil and dependable water, making them ideal for dense agricultural settlement. It was in these plains that early farming societies grew, population increased, and the first cities and dynastic centers emerged. To the north, however, the edge of the steppe brought Chinese farmers into contact with mobile pastoralists, creating a frontier that would become one of the great engines of Chinese history. To the south, wetter hills and river valleys favoured rice cultivation and supported a different ecological world. Farther west, huge mountain chains and deserts formed formidable barriers that long helped isolate the Chinese world from the civilizations of Western Eurasia. That relative isolation mattered. Unlike the ancient states of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Eastern Mediterranean, the early states of East Asia developed with far less direct pressure from neighbouring agrarian civilizations. This encouraged strong internal integration and distinctive ideas about rulership, order, and social responsibility. But isolation was never complete. Contacts with Korea, with island regions to the east, with forested lands to the south, and with pastoral groups to the north and northwest all contributed to the formation of Chinese civilization. The frontier zones were not empty. They were places of exchange, adaptation, and cultural contact. Evidence of these interactions appears in northwestern China, where farming societies lived close to steppe communities. In the Gansu corridor, archaeology reveals signs that settled agricultural groups and neighbouring pastoralists exchanged goods and perhaps depended on each other in important ways. Metal objects of steppe type appear in farming contexts, suggesting sustained contact rather than simple conflict. Farther west, the remarkable preserved bodies found in the Tarim Basin indicate that peoples with different physical backgrounds and burial traditions met and coexisted in this wider frontier world. Such discoveries point to a far more connected early Inner Asia than older historical models once assumed. The earliest firmly established farming societies of northern China took shape in the Yellow River Valley. There, by the 7th millennium BCE, communities were already cultivating millet, a hardy crop well suited to relatively dry conditions. Over time, settled villages multiplied, and by the 5th millennium, BCE farming populations in the Middle Yellow River region had grown substantially. These communities raised crops such as millet and beans, used hemp for fibre, and kept domestic animals including pigs, sheep, cattle, and ducks. Archaeologists identify one of the most important of these early cultural horizons by its painted pottery. But its greater significance lies in what it reveals about social development. Increasingly permanent villages, expanding food production, and a more complex agricultural way of life. By the late 4th and early 3rd millennia, BCE, society in the Yellow River Basin had become still more sophisticated. Larger settlements appeared, craft production advanced, and social differences became more visible. During this broad era, one of the most consequential discoveries in world history likely took place in China: the controlled production of silk. At some point, people learned how to unwind the filaments from silkworm cocoons and turn them into threads suitable for weaving. This innovation remained deeply tied to East Asia and would later become one of the defining products of Chinese civilization in the wider Eurasian world. Early in the second millennium BCE, more clearly state-like structures began to appear. Archaeological evidence from central China points to a culture centered on substantial settlements, bronze production, and organized political authority. Later, historical tradition remembered an early dynasty before the Shang, and although the exact relationship between legend and archaeology remains debated, the broader reality is unmistakable. By this period, parts of northern China had moved beyond village society into an age of kingship, planned centers, and expanding elite power. The Shang that followed created one of the first unmistakable dynastic states in East Asian history. Their rule extended over a significant territory, and they were associated with major advances in political organization, bronze casting, ritual life, and urban development. Shang rulers claimed a sacred connection to divine and ancestral powers, and their authority rested not only on military strength, but also on ritual control. Their elite culture produced rich bronze vessels, carefully organized centers of power, elaborate burials, and striking forms of craftsmanship in jade and other materials. Perhaps the most extraordinary Shang legacy was the development of the earliest known writing system in East Asia. Unlike the earliest writing in some other regions, which was closely tied to accounting and administration, early Chinese writing appears first in a ritual setting. It was used to communicate with ancestral spirits through divination. Questions were inscribed onto animal bones and turtle shells, which were then heated until they cracked. Interpreting those cracks was part of a sacred process through which rulers sought guidance on warfare, harvests, weather, illness, and political decisions. These inscriptions preserve an extraordinary record of Shang concerns, beliefs, and authority. In the royal courts of early China, rulers sought answers not only from their advisors, but from the spirits of their ancestors. Questions about harvests, warfare, weather, and the future of the state were carefully carved onto animal bones and turtle shells. Once inscribed, these objects were heated until they cracked. The patterns formed by the cracks were then read as responses from the unseen world. In many cases, the interpreted answer was added beside the original question, creating a permanent record of both inquiry and belief. Through this process, political decision-making became deeply tied to ritual, and to the idea that the living remained connected to those who had come before. Thousands of these inscribed objects have survived, and they reveal something remarkable about the early Chinese writing system. Many of the characters used at that time can still be recognized today. Unlike other ancient writing traditions that eventually disappeared or had to be rediscovered, the Chinese script, developed during this early period, continued to evolve without ever breaking its connection to the past. This system was based on symbols that carried both meaning and sound, and it was not easy to master. Learning it required years of dedication. Because of this difficulty, literacy became a powerful form of authority. Over time, those who could read and write formed an educated elite that would shape government, culture, and intellectual life for centuries. While ritual and writing strengthened royal authority, the rulers themselves depended on military power to maintain control. Armies were used to suppress rival groups, demand tribute, and capture laborers. Yet even with these tools, the ruling house could not hold its dominance forever. To the west, a rising power known as the Zhou grew stronger over time. Originating in the river valleys beyond the core lands of the earlier dynasty, they gradually expanded their influence. After a long period of tension and conflict, they launched a decisive campaign that brought an end to the old order. The last ruler was overthrown and killed, and a new dynasty took control. marking a major turning point in early Chinese history. The Zhou did more than replace one ruling family with another. They introduced a new way of explaining political power itself. According to their view, authority did not belong to a ruler simply by birth. Instead, it was granted by a higher cosmic force. This idea, later known as the mandate of heaven, suggested that the right to rule depended on moral behavior. A just and capable ruler would retain divine support, while a corrupt or ineffective one would lose it. When disasters, unrest, or decline appeared, they could be interpreted as signs that heaven had withdrawn its favour. This concept allowed the Zhou to justify their conquest, while also setting a standard that future rulers would be judged against. Under Zhou rule, the structure of government changed significantly. Rather than controlling every region directly, the rulers relied on a network of allied leaders who governed local territories in their name. These regional powers were expected to provide loyalty, tribute, and military support. At first, this system worked well, creating a broad and stable political order. Over time, however, those local rulers grew stronger and more independent. They built their own armies, developed their own administrations, and began to compete with one another. Eventually, central authority weakened, and the unity of the state gave way to widespread conflict. The centuries that followed were marked by intense rivalry and almost constant warfare. Yet this was not only an age of destruction, it was also a time of transformation. Social structures began to shift as land could be bought and sold, allowing new groups to rise in wealth and influence. Technological changes, especially the spread of iron tools and weapons, made both farming and warfare more efficient. At the same time, thinkers across different regions began to reflect deeply on the causes of disorder and the possibility of restoring harmony. Out of this turbulent period emerged several influential philosophical traditions. Some thinkers believed that order could be restored through education, ethics, and proper conduct. They argued that leadership should be based on knowledge and moral character, rather than birth alone. Others took a very different approach, suggesting that human ambition and interference were the root of chaos. According to this view, the best path was to step back from excessive control and live in balance with the natural flow of the universe. A third perspective rejected both idealism and withdrawal, insisting instead that strong laws and strict enforcement were the only reliable way to maintain stability. It was this last approach that ultimately proved decisive. One state in the northwest adopted a system based on rigid laws and centralized authority. Through discipline, organization, and often harsh methods, it defeated its rivals one by one and brought the long period of conflict to an end. Its ruler then proclaimed himself the first emperor, creating a new political order that transformed the entire region. This new regime moved quickly to consolidate power. Regional elites were relocated and kept under close watch, preventing them from organizing resistance. The land was divided into administrative units governed by officials rather than hereditary nobles. Weapons were collected from the population to reduce the risk of rebellion. A uniform system of writing, measurement, and currency was imposed to unify the state. These changes created a level of central control that had never existed before. At the same time, massive construction projects reshaped the landscape. Defensive walls built by earlier states were connected into a vast barrier stretching across the northern frontier. This structure was designed to protect against incursions from the steppe and required enormous labor to complete. Another monumental project was the construction of the emperor's tomb, an immense underground complex guarded by thousands of life-sized clay soldiers arranged in precise formation. These figures, each uniquely crafted, represented an entire army prepared to serve their ruler, even in death. Despite its achievements, this powerful state did not endure. The burden placed on the population, combined with harsh laws and internal tensions, led to rebellion soon after the death of its founder. Within a short time, the dynasty collapsed, and a new leader emerged from among the rebels to establish a different kind of rule. This new dynasty retained many of the structural innovations of its predecessor, but governed in a more balanced way. Taxes were reduced, and efforts were made to win the support of scholars and thinkers. Instead of relying entirely on fear and punishment, the new rulers combined administrative control with moral philosophy. Over time, they developed a system in which educated officials played a central role in governing the state. The empire that grew under this new leadership became one of the largest and most organized political systems of its time. It expanded in all directions, reaching into new territories and incorporating diverse populations. To manage such a vast realm, a complex administrative structure was created. The land was divided into regions overseen by appointed officials, with further divisions extending down to local communities. This system required a large and skilled bureaucracy, and positions were increasingly filled by individuals selected for their knowledge and ability rather than their birth. One of the most important developments during this period was the growing influence of a philosophical tradition that emphasized moral conduct, loyalty, and respect within society. Under a powerful emperor, this philosophy became the official guiding principle of the state. Education was organized around its teachings, and those who wished to enter government service were expected to master its ideas. This helped create a class of scholar officials who combined intellectual training with administrative responsibility. These officials were not simply passive servants of authority. They were expected to uphold ethical standards and, when necessary, to criticize policies they believed were harmful. Their role introduced a form of internal balance within the government, as they acted as a counterweight to the personal power of the ruler and the influence of court insiders. This system would remain a defining feature of Chinese governance for centuries. Even so, practical governance still required strict laws and discipline. Punishments could be severe, and the state continued to demand labor and military service from its population. Expansion also became a major priority. Armies were sent to secure borders, defeat rivals, and extend control into new regions. Campaigns in the south, west, and north brought new lands under imperial authority and opened connections with distant peoples. As the empire expanded, its population grew to extraordinary levels. Tens of millions of people lived under its rule, making it one of the largest political entities in the ancient world. Managing such a population required not only administrative skill, but also economic resources. To support military campaigns and state projects, the government developed new ways of raising revenue. It issued coinage, controlled key industries, and adjusted taxation. These policies sparked debate among officials, some of whom argued that the pursuit of wealth should not guide the actions of the state, while others insisted that such measures were necessary for survival and security. Emperor Wudi had the strength and authority to manage the economic strain and social tension created by his ambitious policies. Heavy taxation, military campaigns, and state-controlled industries placed pressure on the population, especially the peasants. Yet during his reign, these pressures were contained. After his death, however, the situation changed rapidly. A series of weaker rulers followed, lacking the authority and vision needed to maintain stability. Gradually, the foundations of the early Han state began to weaken, and unrest started to grow. Amid this instability, a powerful court official named Wang Mang rose to prominence. Presenting himself as a defender of moral governance and a model Confucian leader, he gained influence at the highest levels of power. When the young emperor died, Wang Mang seized the opportunity. He declared the end of the existing dynasty and proclaimed a new one, placing himself at its head. His rise marked a dramatic shift, not only in leadership but also in the direction of government policy. Once in power, Wang Mang introduced a series of bold reforms aimed at easing the hardships faced by ordinary people. He attempted to eliminate debt slavery, a system that had trapped many peasants in cycles of dependency and poverty. He also introduced land reforms designed to distribute farmland more fairly among families, hoping to reduce inequality and restore balance to rural society. In addition, he sought to stabilize the economy by creating state agencies that would regulate the supply of essential goods. These institutions were meant to buy surplus products when prices were low and release them during times of shortage, preventing extreme fluctuations and protecting the population from famine and inflation. Despite the ambition behind these reforms, the results were disappointing. The policies were difficult to implement, and resistance from powerful landowners undermined their effectiveness. At the same time, nature dealt a series of devastating blows. Severe droughts dried up crops, swarms of locusts destroyed what remained, and catastrophic flooding along the Yellow River displaced entire communities. These disasters intensified existing problems and pushed the fragile system toward collapse. As conditions worsened, rebellion spread across the countryside. Discontented groups rose against the government, and Wang Mang found himself unable to control the growing chaos. His authority crumbled, and he was eventually killed during an uprising in the Wei River region. His attempt to reshape society through sweeping reform had ended in failure, leaving the state deeply fractured. Not long after, a member of the original ruling family, Liu Shu, emerged as a new leader. Though only a distant relative of the earlier founders, he successfully rallied support and restored the old dynasty. With this, a new phase began, often known as the later Han period. This renewed regime managed to re-establish order and would continue to govern for nearly 2 more centuries, though it would face its own challenges over time. Looking back across these centuries, the story of early China reveals a long process of transformation. The earliest farming communities gradually developed into complex societies, giving rise to powerful states and dynasties. Each period introduced new political ideas, social structures, and technological advances. Concepts such as moral authority, cosmic order, and strict legal control were not simply abstract theories. They became practical tools used to justify power and organize society. Philosophical traditions played a central role in shaping this world. Ethical teachings emphasized responsibility, hierarchy, and personal conduct. Other schools of thought encouraged harmony with nature or insisted on strict discipline through law. Over time, these ideas were adapted and combined, forming the intellectual foundation of governance. One tradition in particular came to dominate, influencing education, administration, and political life for generations. By the time of the Han, these developments had produced one of the most sophisticated states in the ancient world. A vast bureaucracy managed the empire, supported by a system that valued learning and moral character. Military strength secured its borders, while economic policies sustained its expansion. At the same time, internal tensions and external pressures constantly tested the resilience of the system. These transformations did not occur in isolation. As the Han expanded westward, they came into contact with distant regions and unfamiliar cultures. Diplomatic missions, military campaigns, and trade routes gradually connected East Asia to the wider world. Goods, ideas, and technologies began to move across great distances, linking societies that had once developed separately. The stage was now set for a new era. The foundations of long-distance exchange had been laid, and the networks that would later be known as the Silk Roads were beginning to take shape. The rise and evolution of early Chinese civilization had not only transformed its own society, but had also played a crucial role in connecting the far ends of Eurasia into a shared historical experience. By the final decades of the 1st century, BCE, Han involvement in Central Asia had gone far beyond occasional diplomacy or temporary military expeditions. The court was now committed to maintaining influence across the Tarim Basin and protecting the chain of commanderies, garrisons, and allied oasis states that had become vital to its Western policy. To make that control permanent, the Han government created a new high office responsible for managing the entire region. A protector general was appointed and stationed in the Western territories, giving the dynasty an enduring military and political presence deep beyond its old frontier. This step allowed the Han to supervise both the northern and southern routes that curved around the Taklimakan Desert, and to strengthen its authority over the many oasis kingdoms scattered along them. The effect was immediate. Local rulers and rival steppe leaders now had to reckon with the fact that Han power was no longer appearing only in raids or embassies, but had settled into the region as a permanent force. This Western commitment was one of the most important consequences of the journeys first opened by Zhang Qian. He did not live long enough to witness many of the changes that followed, but his mission had altered the direction of Chinese policy in a profound way. Later, historians praised him not only for his endurance, but for his character. He was remembered as a man whose determination survived imprisonment, hardship, and repeated danger, and as someone who won trust among peoples far from home. That reputation mattered. The routes he explored became easier for later envoys to use because his name and memory had already opened doors. In that sense, his achievement was not simply that he reached distant lands, but that he made future contact possible. His report had shown the Han court that beyond the deserts and mountain barriers there existed wealthy states, strategic alliances, military possibilities, and commercial opportunities that could not be ignored. Had his mission failed entirely, the history of Eurasia might have unfolded very differently. Without his escape from captivity and his return to the Han court, China may have remained far longer in relative ignorance of the lands beyond the western frontier. The court might not have recognized the scale of Central Asia's political and economic importance, and later expansion into the Tarim Basin could have been delayed or redirected. Even more striking is the fact that his failure to persuade the Yuezhi to return eastward may have mattered just as much as his success in reaching them. Because they stayed in Bactria instead of returning to fight the Xiongnu, they were able to build the foundations of what would become the Kushan Empire, one of the major powers in the great trans-Eurasian exchange system of the centuries that followed. The campaigns against the Xiongnu formed the harsh geopolitical backdrop to all these developments. Emperor Wudi had abandoned the older policy of accommodation and tribute in favour of aggressive expansion, and over decades of brutal warfare, Han forces had pushed the Xiongnu farther back into the northern steppe. Fortified positions, military farms, commanderies, and diplomatic alliances gradually turned the western frontier into a zone of organised imperial control. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Han state had secured enough influence to support a stable western network of tributary states and military posts. This did not mean the region was peaceful, but it did mean that long-distance movement between China and Central Asia had become more realistic, more regular, and more politically protected than ever before. This transformation mattered because East Asia had long stood apart from the older exchange systems of Western Eurasia. Civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Iranian plateau, and the Indus world had been in contact with one another for many centuries, through trade, migration, and war. China, by contrast, remained separated by distance, desert, mountains, and the power of nomadic confederations that controlled the space in between. The rise of the Han Empire changed that balance. A large agrarian state had now emerged in East Asia with the power to project force westward, protect routes, and sustain diplomatic and material contact across Inner Asia. Once that happened, China was no longer merely a distant civilization behind natural barriers. It became an active participant in the wider Afro-Eurasian world. This did not mean that exchange between China and the lands farther west had never existed before. Goods from southern Chinese regions had already made their way into India and Central Asia along older overland networks, and for centuries Chinese states had traded with pastoral peoples along the northern and western frontier. Horses, jade, furs, metal goods, bows, and luxury items had long crossed these borderlands in both peaceful and violent forms of exchange. But under the Han, these scattered connections were transformed into something larger and more systematic. The movement of silk, precious goods, diplomatic gifts, information, and political influence now intensified on a scale not seen before. Among the most important elements in this process was the role of tribute and diplomacy. Enormous quantities of silk had already been sent to the Xiongnu under earlier peace agreements in exchange for temporary stability along the frontier. These transfers were vast enough to suggest that silk was already moving westward in significant amounts before the Han fully secured the Tarim Basin. But the most dynamic mechanism for silk reaching Central Asia appears to have come through the diplomatic missions sent by the Han court after the return of Jiang Qian. These embassies carried gold, silk, livestock, and other valuables to rulers across the western regions. Officially, these goods were tribute, gifts, or payment for assistance and supplies. In practice, they also fed a growing web of commerce. These missions were often massive. Some contained several hundred people, while even smaller delegations could number more than 100. They moved frequently, sometimes so often that routes to the western lands seemed crowded with one embassy after another. The court equipped them with rich cargoes meant to impress local rulers, secure alliances, and reinforce Han prestige. Yet the men who carried these goods were not always noble representatives of state policy. Many were opportunists. Contemporary accounts describe them as greedy, unreliable, and eager to use government resources for private enrichment. They treated official gifts as if they were their own property, buying local goods cheaply in the West and bringing them back to China for profit. The silk, entrusted to them for diplomacy, could therefore slip very easily into the hands of merchants and intermediaries. This pattern helps explain how silk began moving west, not simply as a royal gift, but as a commodity. The official circuits of diplomacy created channels of travel, trust, and logistical support. Around those channels, commercial behavior flourished. Central Asian towns supplied lodging, food, animals, and market access. Chinese envoys, or men traveling under their cover, exchanged silk and other valuables in return. What the official record condemned as theft or corruption may in reality have been part of the earliest sustained commercial structure linking Han China to Central Asia. In other words, diplomacy created the framework and trade grew inside it. The reaction of local populations to these missions reveals how power operated on the routes. Xiongnu envoys were feared and were often escorted and supplied without question. Han envoys, by contrast, were expected to pay. Local rulers and merchants knew that China was far away and rich, and they saw no reason to provide support unless compensated. This difference shows that Han prestige alone was not enough in the early stages. Influence had to be built, and silk was one of the key tools used to build it. The result was the emergence of a hybrid system in which state ambition, frontier politics, tribute, and private profit all combined to push Chinese goods farther west. The geography of the routes made every part of this process difficult. Movement from the Han heartland into Central Asia meant crossing some of the harshest terrain in Eurasia. Mountains, desert basins, salt flats, arid corridors, and dramatic shifts in temperature all shaped the path. Travelers needed water above all else. Access to food mattered too, which meant that the routes depended on places where irrigation agriculture could support life. Towns and oasis states flourished only where water could be captured, stored, and distributed with great care. For this reason, the routes of the Eastern Silk Roads were never random lines across empty land. They were chains of survival, linking one watered zone to another. In the great river deltas of Central Asia and in the fertile lands watered by the Amu Darya and Syr complex irrigation systems supported large populations and major urban centres. These regions helped sustain some of the most important cities connected to long-distance exchange. Farther east, around the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, life depended on oasis agriculture, fed by underground channels and carefully managed water systems. Such technology made settlement possible in environments that would otherwise have been nearly uninhabitable. In places like Turfan, water descending from nearby mountains could be directed underground through channels that preserved it from evaporation and delivered it to fields and reservoirs. These systems supported both local populations and the waves of travellers, envoys, animals, and merchants moving through the region. The Han understood that control of routes required not just soldiers, but agriculture and infrastructure. As the dynasty pushed westward, it established military farms and garrison colonies along the Hexi corridor and farther beyond. Soldiers and labourers built irrigation works, cultivated the land, and turned in fragile frontier outposts into defensible settlements. These stations provided food, water, animals, and communications for the movement of armies and diplomatic missions. At the same time, the Han extended its defensive walls farther west, eventually reaching the famous frontier gate that later became known as the Jade Gate. This outpost stood as a symbolic and practical threshold between the Chinese world and the lands beyond. Through it passed soldiers, diplomats, tribute goods, precious stones, and of course silk. All of these efforts made the eastern routes of the Silk Roads viable. Without water management, fortified stations, military protection, and stable relations with oasis states, no sustained movement across this landscape would have been possible. The Han did not invent the roads of Inner Asia, but it reorganized them, defended them, and tied them more firmly to a large agrarian empire than ever before. In doing so, it helped transform older frontier paths into a durable network of transcontinental exchange. The real significance of these developments lies in the scale of the change. China had once stood at the far eastern edge of Eurasia, separated from the West by distance and danger. Now it was dispatching missions, projecting military force, negotiating with steppe confederations, dominating oasis kingdoms, and circulating luxury goods deep into Central Asia. Silk, which had once moved mainly within more limited political and regional systems, was beginning to travel across a much wider world. Along with it moved ideas, technologies, artistic influences, religious concepts, and new tastes. The eastern routes of the Silk Roads were not born in a single moment, but by the late Han period their foundations had clearly been laid. Through war, diplomacy, logistics, and opportunistic trade, East Asia had been drawn into a connected Eurasian system, from which it would never again be fully separate. During the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, the long journey from China into Central Asia usually began in one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Chang'an stood at the heart of the Han Empire, a vast and carefully planned capital whose name reflected an ideal of lasting peace. Over time, it grew into a massive urban centre, filled with wide avenues, walled districts, and busy markets that attracted people from across the empire. Its population rose steadily, turning it into a crowded and vibrant place where officials, soldiers, merchants, and farmers all moved through its ordered streets. The city's layout followed strict planning traditions, with gates opening in all directions and roads leading outward toward distant lands. Among these, the western routes would become the most important for long-distance exchange. Caravans carrying silk, precious goods, and diplomatic gifts typically departed through the western gates and crossed the Wei River before heading toward the narrow corridor that linked China to Central Asia. This passage, known as the Hexi Corridor, stretched for more than 1,000 kilometers and formed a natural bridge between the Chinese heartland and the deserts beyond. It had once been contested territory, but after a series of military campaigns, it fell under Han control. To secure it, the empire established fortified settlements and agricultural colonies along the route. These were not just military outposts, but functioning communities where soldiers farmed the land, built irrigation systems, and created stable supply points for travelers moving in both directions. Among these frontier settlements, one oasis town stood out above all others. Dunhuang became a crucial stopping point at the edge of the desert world. Surrounded by shifting sands, it offered something rare and invaluable: water, food, and safety. Travelers arriving there after weeks of travel could rest, repair their equipment, and prepare for the next stage of the journey. The town also served as a key junction, connecting routes that led westward into the Tarim Basin and others that linked to regions further south and north. Its position made it a meeting place for soldiers, envoys, merchants, and eventually religious travelers, all passing through on their way across Eurasia. Beyond Dunhuang lay one of the greatest natural obstacles in the ancient world. The Taklamakan Desert stretched across the heart of Central Asia, a vast and hostile expanse of sand where survival was nearly impossible without careful planning. Extreme temperatures, violent sandstorms, and the absence of reliable water sources made any direct crossing unthinkable. Instead, travelers moved along the edges of the desert, following routes that curved around its northern and southern boundaries. These paths were not chosen at random. They were determined by the presence of oasis towns, small pockets of life made possible by water flowing down from surrounding mountain ranges. These oasis settlements formed a chain of survival. Streams fed by melting snow were captured and guided into underground channels, allowing agriculture to flourish even in harsh conditions. Towns such as Kucha, Turfan, and Khotan provided places where caravans could stop, rest, and resupply. Without these settlements, long-distance travel across the region would have been impossible. They allowed large groups of people, along with their animals and goods, to move steadily across terrain that would otherwise have blocked all communication between east and west. The journey around the desert could take many months. Caravans moved slowly, stopping each night in secure locations where water and shelter were available. Eventually, the northern and southern routes converged again at the far western edge of the Tarim Basin. There, in a fertile oasis surrounded by cultivated land, stood the city of Kashgar. After the long and exhausting passage around the desert, this place must have seemed like a reward. Fields of grain and fruit trees replaced the barren landscapes of the journey, and the city became a major centre where goods were exchanged and redistributed. For many travellers coming from China, this marked the end of their westward journey. The silk and other goods they carried did not continue with them much farther. Instead, they passed into the hands of local traders and intermediaries, who specialised in carrying products across the next stages of the route. From this point, goods could move in several directions. Some travelled west, toward the great cities of Central Asia and beyond, while others were carried south toward the Indian subcontinent, and eventually to maritime trade routes that reached distant ports. The infrastructure that supported these movements was simple but effective. Along the main routes, travellers stayed in large roadside inns designed to accommodate entire caravans. These buildings provided shelter storage space, and protection within thick walls. Inside, merchants and their animals could rest after a long day of travel. Fires were lit, food was prepared, and conversations filled the air. People from different regions, speaking different languages, exchanged news, ideas, and information about the road ahead. These stops were not only places of rest, but also centres of communication, where knowledge about routes, dangers, and opportunities spread from one group to another. The challenges did not end at the edge of the desert. Beyond Kashgar, travellers faced another series of obstacles in the form of massive mountain ranges. The terrain rose sharply, forming a complex system of high peaks, narrow valleys, and dangerous passes. Only a few routes allowed passage through this region, and each required careful navigation. Some paths led westward through fertile valleys and into the heart of Central Asia, while others turned south toward the Indian subcontinent. These routes were difficult and often dangerous, with steep drops, unstable paths, and unpredictable weather conditions. Accounts from the time describe just how perilous these crossings could be. In some places, the path narrowed to little more than a ledge carved into the mountainside, with sheer drops below. Travellers sometimes had to tie themselves together with ropes to avoid falling, helping each other across the most dangerous sections. Animals that slipped could not be saved, and accidents often proved fatal. These conditions remind us that the Silk Roads were not a single road, but a network of routes shaped by geography, where survival depended on endurance, skill, and cooperation. The movement of goods across such terrain required not only human effort, but also the support of specially adapted animals. The Bactrian camel played a crucial role in this system. With its 2 humps and strong build, it was perfectly suited to the harsh conditions of Central Asia. It could carry heavy loads for long distances, survive with limited water, and endure both extreme heat and freezing temperatures. Its broad feet allowed it to walk easily across sand, while its thick coat protected it in colder climates. These qualities made it the ideal transport animal for long-distance trade. Silk, the most valuable commodity carried along these routes, was carefully packed and transported in large quantities. It was prized not only for its beauty but also for its rarity outside of China. The production of silk required a complex process involving the cultivation of silkworms and the careful handling of their delicate threads. Over centuries, Chinese communities developed highly specialized techniques to produce fine silk on a large scale. This knowledge was closely guarded, allowing Chinese producers to maintain control over a product that was in high demand across Eurasia. The scale of silk production during the Han period was remarkable. Vast numbers of silkworms were raised, and large quantities of silk were processed into thread and fabric. This material was used within China for clothing, tools, and even as a form of payment. At the same time, it became a key element in diplomacy and trade. Large shipments were sent as gifts or tribute, while others were exchanged for goods and services along the routes. As silk moved westward, it became a symbol of wealth and status, valued by elites in distant lands who had little understanding of how it was produced. What began as a controlled and carefully managed industry within China gradually became part of a much larger economic system. Silk passed from the hands of officials to merchants, from merchants to intermediaries, and from one region to another. Along the way, it connected different cultures and economies, linking distant societies through a shared demand for valuable goods. The routes that carried it were shaped by geography, supported by infrastructure, and sustained by the efforts of countless individuals who travelled them. At the same time, far to the west, another major power was undergoing its own transformation. Rome, once a small settlement, had grown into a dominant force in the Mediterranean world. Its expansion was not the result of a single plan, but of a series of conflicts and responses to external threats. Early in its history, Rome faced attacks from neighbouring peoples and learned quickly that survival required strength and organisation. Over time, it developed a disciplined and effective military system that allowed it to defeat its rivals and expand its influence. One of Rome's greatest challenges came from the powerful city of Carthage. Located in North Africa, Carthage controlled key trade routes and possessed a strong navy. Conflict between the two powers became unavoidable, leading to a series of long and devastating wars. These struggles, known as the Punic Wars, stretched across the Mediterranean and involved massive armies and fleets. Battles were fought on land and sea, from Spain to Italy and beyond. The scale of these conflicts was immense, and the cost in human lives was enormous. In the end, Rome emerged victorious, but the victory came at a high price. Entire regions were devastated, cities were destroyed, and countless people were killed or displaced. These wars marked a turning point in Roman history. They transformed Rome from a regional power into a dominant empire that controlled vast territories. This expansion created the conditions for increased contact with distant regions, including those connected by the Silk Roads. As Rome stabilized and consolidated its power, new opportunities for trade and exchange began to emerge. The demand for luxury goods grew among its elites, and silk became one of the most desired materials. Although the Romans did not fully understand its origins, they recognized its value and beauty. Over time, silk would become a symbol of status in Roman society, linking the Mediterranean world to the distant regions of Central and East Asia. By the end of the long struggle between Rome and Carthage, one of the greatest powers of the ancient Mediterranean had been completely erased. Carthage was destroyed, its cities reduced to ruins, and its culture faded into history. This outcome came despite the extraordinary brilliance of its most famous general, Hannibal. During the Second Punic War, he carried out one of the most daring campaigns ever attempted, leading an army from Spain across rivers and hostile lands and over the frozen heights of the Alps into Italy itself. It was a moment when the survival of Rome hung in the balance. Had Rome failed to withstand this invasion, its expansion would have ended before it truly began, and the history of the wider world might have followed a very different path. Instead, Rome endured. From that crisis, it emerged stronger and more determined, no longer just a regional power in Italy, but a dominant force across the Mediterranean. By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, Rome had begun building an empire that stretched across continents. At nearly the same moment in time, far to the east, the Han dynasty in China was also expanding its reach into Central Asia. Though separated by vast distances, both powers were now stepping onto the stage as major imperial forces. The long conflict with Carthage had reshaped Roman identity, teaching its leaders to think on a global scale and to operate armies far from home. This experience would define Roman power for centuries to come. The origins of this transformation lay in a series of brutal wars. The first major clash began when Carthaginian forces moved into Sicily, triggering a prolonged struggle for control of the western Mediterranean. Rome, lacking naval experience, suffered enormous losses at sea. Hundreds of ships were destroyed and thousands of sailors drowned. Yet Rome refused to give up. Each defeat was followed by renewed effort. New fleets were built, and the war continued until Carthage was finally forced to accept peace. In the aftermath, Rome took control of key islands, marking the beginning of its expansion beyond Italy. Carthage, however, was not prepared to accept defeat. A new generation of leaders sought revenge, and none was more determined than Hannibal. As a young commander, he took control of Carthaginian forces in Spain and soon provoked Rome into another war. Instead of waiting for the Romans to attack, he made the bold decision to strike first. Marching north through unfamiliar lands, he crossed into Gaul and then turned toward the towering barrier of the Alps. It was a move that few would have considered possible, especially with winter approaching. The crossing of the Alps became one of the most legendary moments in military history. Hannibal's army struggled through snow, ice, and narrow mountain paths, losing many men and animals along the way. Yet he succeeded in bringing his forces into northern Italy, where his sudden appearance shocked the Romans. They had not expected an enemy to arrive from that direction, and they were unprepared for what followed. In a series of battles, Hannibal demonstrated remarkable tactical skill. Roman armies were defeated one after another. At the Trebia River, Roman forces were lured into a trap and overwhelmed. At Lake Trasimene, an entire army was ambushed and destroyed in a surprise attack. The most devastating blow came at Cannae, where Hannibal used a brilliant encirclement strategy to annihilate a much larger Roman force. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed in a single day, one of the worst defeats in Roman history. For a time, it seemed that Rome might fall. Hannibal moved freely across Italy, and his victories inspired fear throughout the region. Yet he chose not to march directly on Rome. Instead, he tried to weaken the city by encouraging its allies to abandon it. This strategy met with only limited success. Despite their losses, most of Rome's allies remained loyal. The Roman leadership adapted, avoiding large battles and focusing instead on wearing down Hannibal's forces over time. Gradually, the balance began to shift. Rome rebuilt its strength and regained confidence. While Hannibal remained in Italy, Roman forces launched a bold counterattack against Carthage itself. This forced Hannibal to return home to defend his city. In the final confrontation, the Roman general Scipio defeated him, bringing the war to an end. Carthage was left weakened, and its power was broken. The outcome of this long struggle reshaped the Mediterranean world. Rome emerged as the dominant power, while Carthage faded into history. The victory was not only a military achievement, but also a demonstration of Roman resilience and political strength. Even in moments of crisis, Rome maintained the loyalty of its allies, a factor that proved decisive in the end. With its greatest rival defeated, Rome turned its attention to new opportunities. It expanded into Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean, confronting other powers that had once seemed beyond its reach. Kingdoms that attempted to challenge Roman influence were defeated, and new territories were brought under Roman control. By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, Rome had established itself across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. As the empire grew, Rome developed systems to manage its vast territories. Provinces were organized under governors, and administrative structures were put in place to maintain control. This expansion created new connections across regions, linking distant lands through trade and communication. At the same time, it also created new challenges within Roman society. The rapid growth of the empire brought wealth, but it also deepened inequalities. Small farmers, who had once formed the backbone of Roman society, struggled to survive after years of war. Many lost their land and moved to the city, where they joined a growing population of the poor. Meanwhile, wealthy elites expanded their estates, using enslaved labor to produce goods for profit. The gap between rich and poor widened, and tensions within the city increased. Political institutions struggled to cope with these changes. The traditional system of governance, designed for a small city-state, proved inadequate for a vast empire. Corruption became widespread, and public officials often used their positions for personal gain. Efforts to reform the system were met with resistance, and violence became a common tool in political conflicts. These tensions eventually led to a series of civil wars. Powerful leaders competed for control. using armies loyal to them, rather than to the state. The Republic, once stable and effective, began to collapse under the weight of internal conflict. After years of instability, a new form of leadership emerged. A young leader named Octavian rose to power following the assassination of Julius Caesar. Through a combination of military strength and political skill, he defeated his rivals and established himself as the dominant figure in Rome. Although he maintained the appearance of traditional institutions, real power rested in his hands. Over time, he became known as Augustus, marking the beginning of a new era. Under his rule, Rome entered a period of relative peace and stability. The long years of civil war came to an end, and the empire was reorganized. Roads were built, administration was improved, and the economy began to recover. This period, often called the Roman Peace, created the conditions necessary for long-distance trade to flourish. As stability returned, demand for luxury goods increased. Wealthy Romans sought products from distant lands, including spices, precious stones, and above all, silk. Trade networks expanded, connecting the Mediterranean with regions far to the east. Merchants began to invest in long-distance journeys, linking Roman markets with those of Central and South Asia. These connections were not simple or direct. Trade involved multiple stages, with goods passing through many hands before reaching their final destination. Routes crossed deserts, rivers, and mountains, requiring careful organization and cooperation. Despite the challenges, the system grew stronger, supported by the stability that the empire now provided. Most of the movement of goods along the Silk Roads did not take place on land, but across the sea. Ships carried cargo between the ports of South Asia and Roman Egypt, crossing the vast waters of the Indian Ocean. Yet the story was not limited to maritime routes. Evidence from desert cities and scattered ancient accounts reveals that a portion of this exchange still travelled overland, following rivers, valleys, and long-established caravan paths. Some of these land routes moved goods through Mesopotamia, following the Tigris and Euphrates southward toward the Persian Gulf. From there, cargo could be transferred onto ships and carried onward to India. This combination of land and sea created a flexible network, allowing merchants to adapt depending on political conditions and seasonal challenges. In other cases, there are hints that traders ventured even farther east, continuing beyond Mesopotamia into Central Asia and toward the distant frontiers of Han China. Such long overland journeys were most likely attempted during periods when relations between Rome and the Parthian Empire were relatively stable. When tensions rose between these two powers, these routes became far more dangerous. However, during calmer decades, ambitious merchants may have taken advantage of the opportunity to push deeper into Asia. One of the most intriguing clues about these distant connections comes from the writings of Claudius Ptolemy, a scholar who lived in the great city of Alexandria. Ptolemy was known for his wide-ranging knowledge, combining mathematics, astronomy, and geography into detailed works that attempted to describe the known world. In his major geographical study, he set out to map lands, stretching far beyond the Roman Empire. His work relied heavily on earlier information gathered by other geographers, especially a figure named Marinus of Tyre. Although Marinus's original writings have not survived, his influence can still be traced through the coordinates and descriptions preserved in Ptolemy's work. Much of Marinus's knowledge, in turn, came from a merchant named Gnaeus Titianus. This trader, likely based in the eastern Mediterranean, had access to reports from agents who had travelled deep into Central Asia. These journeys were not made by a single individual, but by a network of traders moving step by step across vast distances. Their reports described routes that stretched from the western edges of Asia toward lands that were barely understood in the Roman world. The journey described in these accounts begins in the region of Bactria, a major city in Central Asia. From there, the route climbs into mountainous terrain, crossing difficult passes and narrow valleys. Travelers moved through regions that were remote, rugged, and often dangerous. At one stage, the path led to a place known as the Stone Tower, a mysterious location that has been debated by scholars for centuries. It may have been a trading post, a landmark, or a fortified settlement, marking a key point along the route. From this point, the road appears to continue eastward, eventually reaching areas close to the western boundaries of China. If these accounts are even partly accurate, they suggest that some Western merchants, or at least their agents, managed to reach the edge of the Chinese world. This would represent one of the earliest known attempts to bridge the entire Eurasian continent through land-based trade. The exact path of these routes remains uncertain. Different interpretations suggest different directions, some passing through fertile valleys, others cutting across high mountain passes. The geography of Central Asia, with its deserts, rivers, and towering ranges, made navigation extremely complex. Even today, identifying these ancient routes with certainty is difficult. What is clear, however, is that no single merchant travelled the entire distance. Trade operated through a chain of intermediaries. Goods were passed from one group to another, moving step by step across regions controlled by different peoples. A merchant from the Mediterranean might sell goods in Mesopotamia, where they would be taken over by traders from Iran or Central Asia. These, in turn, would pass them along to others who could carry them farther east. At key locations along these routes, trading centres emerged. These were places where merchants from different cultures met, exchanged goods, and shared information. In such cities, languages, ideas, and customs blended together. Goods from China, India, and the Mediterranean could all be found in the same markets, handled by traders who might never see the lands where those items originated. These centres were not only economic hubs, but also cultural crossroads. Artistic styles, religious beliefs, and technologies moved along the same routes as silk and spices. A design created in one region could appear in another, thousands of kilometres away. Musical instruments, crops, and even stories travelled alongside merchandise. In these distant and often isolated locations, the world was more connected than it might appear. Traders, guides, and caravan leaders formed networks that linked civilizations across enormous distances. Their work made it possible for goods and ideas to circulate between regions that had no direct contact. The importance of these exchanges goes far beyond commerce. While silk and other luxury goods captured the attention of elites, the deeper impact lay in the blending of cultures. Civilizations that had developed independently for centuries were now influencing one another in subtle but lasting ways. At the same time, this process brought challenges. As foreign goods and ideas entered established societies, they sometimes clashed with traditional values. In both East and West, conservative voices expressed concern about the influence of outside cultures. New religions, unfamiliar customs, and exotic products were not always welcomed. Despite these concerns, the flow of goods continued. In Rome, demand for luxury items became increasingly intense. Silk, in particular, captured the imagination of the elite. Its light texture and shimmering appearance made it highly desirable, and its rarity only increased its value. Roman writers often described it as both beautiful and troubling, associating it with luxury, excess, and moral decline. Some saw silk as a symbol of refinement and status, while others viewed it as a sign of weakness. Its transparency made it especially controversial, as it blurred the line between clothing and display. Critics argued that it encouraged vanity and indulgence, while supporters embraced it as the ultimate expression of wealth and elegance. Attempts were made to restrict its use, especially among men. Laws were proposed to limit the wearing of silk reflecting concerns about both morality and economic cost. Yet these efforts had little lasting effect. The appeal of such luxury proved too strong, and silk continued to flow into the empire. The financial impact of this trade was enormous. Vast sums of wealth left the Roman world each year in exchange for goods from the east. Spices, gemstones, and fine textiles all commanded high prices. Some observers warned that this drain of wealth could weaken the state, while others recognized that trade also brought benefits through taxation and economic activity. In reality, the system was complex. While Rome imported large quantities of luxury goods, it also exported its own products, including glassware, metal goods, and agricultural produce. Trade created a dynamic exchange rather than a simple one-way flow. After the assassination of King Philip, power passed suddenly to his young son, Alexander. At only 20 years old, he inherited not just the throne of Macedonia, but influence over much of the Greek world. What followed was one of the most daring military campaigns in history. In 334 BCE, Alexander launched an invasion of the vast Persian Empire, a bold move against a power far larger than his own. Alexander was no ordinary ruler. He had been trained by some of the greatest minds of his time, and he combined intelligence with physical strength and remarkable ambition. He was a skilled rider, a disciplined athlete, and above all, a brilliant commander. His leadership inspired deep loyalty among his troops, and his ability to adapt in battle allowed him to overcome overwhelming odds. The Persian forces outnumbered him significantly, yet Alexander defeated them again and again. His most decisive victory came in 331 BCE at the Battle of Gaugamela. There, he shattered the army of the Persian king and secured control over enormous wealth and territory. With this victory, he effectively became the ruler of the Persian Empire. But Alexander did not stop. He continued pushing eastward, marching through Central Asia and reaching as far as the Indus River. Along the way, he founded dozens of cities, many of which carried his name. These settlements were not only military outposts, but also centers of cultural exchange. His journey also brought him into contact with new peoples and traditions, and he even married a Central Asian noblewoman, blending cultures at the highest level. Despite his unstoppable momentum, his life ended abruptly. In 323 BCE, at just 33 years old, Alexander died in Babylon. His empire, vast but fragile, did not survive intact for long. Without a clear successor, it was divided among his generals, each of whom claimed a portion of the territory. Over the following decades, these divisions gave rise to a new cultural era. Greek influence spread widely, not through conquest alone, but through trade, migration, and administration. This period is often described as a time when Greek culture blended with local traditions across a vast region, stretching from the Mediterranean to parts of India. Different regions came under the control of different ruling families. Macedonia and Greece were governed by the descendants of one of Alexander's generals, while Egypt became a powerful and wealthy kingdom centered on the city of Alexandria. This city grew into one of the greatest urban centers of the ancient world, known for its trade, diversity, and intellectual life. Scholars, merchants, and travelers from many regions gathered there, creating a vibrant and cosmopolitan atmosphere. Meanwhile, much of Asia fell under the rule of another group of successors. These rulers struggled to maintain control over such a vast and diverse territory. Even so, Greek settlers and traders moved into these lands in large numbers, establishing communities that carried their language and customs far from their original homeland. Greek became widely used in administration and commerce, and it even appeared in official inscriptions in regions far to the east. In Central Asia, Greek-style kingdoms emerged that combined local traditions with Hellenistic influence. These states became important centers of trade and cultural exchange. However, their existence was not permanent. Over time, new groups moving in from the steppes challenged and eventually replaced them, reshaping the political landscape of the region. Through all of these developments, the legacy of Alexander lived on. His empire did not survive as a single political entity, but it created a network of connections that linked distant parts of the world. Trade routes expanded, ideas travelled more freely, and cultures began to interact on a larger scale than ever before. This transformation played a crucial role in connecting Europe and Asia. The lands, once united under Persian rule and later influenced by Greek culture, became a bridge between different civilizations. This connection would later support the rise of new powers and the development of long-distance trade networks that stretched across the entire continent. At the same time, a new force was rising in the east of this region. The Parthians, originally a nomadic group, began to establish control over parts of Iran. They took advantage of the weakening influence of the Hellenistic rulers and gradually built their own empire. Their rise marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Eurasia. The Parthians adapted quickly to the environment they inherited. While their origins were rooted in a mobile, pastoral lifestyle, they learned to govern settled populations and manage large territories. They drew inspiration from earlier empires, adopting administrative methods that had proven effective while maintaining elements of their own traditions. Under strong leaders, the Parthian state expanded rapidly. It stretched from the Iranian plateau into Mesopotamia, bringing key cities and trade routes under its control. These regions were not only politically important, but also economically vital, linking different parts of Eurasia through trade. Their system of rule was less centralized than that of earlier empires. Power was shared among regional authorities, and local rulers retained a degree of independence. This flexible structure allowed the Parthians to manage a diverse population spread across a wide area. At the same time, they maintained strong military capabilities, drawing on both their nomadic heritage and the resources of settled lands. The Parthians also demonstrated a notable level of cultural and religious tolerance. Different belief systems coexisted within their territory, and their cities became places where various traditions could meet and interact. This openness contributed to the cosmopolitan nature of the region and helped sustain long-distance trade. However, their position between powerful neighbours brought constant challenges. To the east, nomadic groups posed a recurring threat, launching raids and invasions that required continuous military response. These groups were highly mobile and difficult to defeat, often avoiding direct confrontation, and instead relying on speed and surprise. In the west, tensions with Rome gradually intensified. Both empires sought influence over key regions, especially Armenia, which lay between them. This competition led to repeated conflicts, as each side attempted to assert control without provoking full-scale war. One of the most famous encounters between the two powers ended in disaster for Rome. In a major battle, Parthian forces used their superior cavalry tactics to devastating effect. Their horse archers, capable of firing accurately while retreating at high speed, inflicted heavy losses on the Roman army. This technique became legendary and demonstrated the effectiveness of steppe-style warfare against more traditional forces. Following this victory, the Parthians gained a reputation as a formidable military power. Their influence extended across a vast region, and their control over key trade routes made them central players in the exchange between East and West. The boundary between the Roman and Parthian worlds became a tense frontier, marked by both conflict and cooperation. Despite periodic wars, the relationship between the two empires was not purely hostile. Diplomatic exchanges took place, and agreements were made to stabilize borders. At times, captured symbols of military defeat were returned as part of negotiated settlements, allowing both sides to claim success. Toward the end of the 2nd century, a striking record appears in Chinese historical writing that sheds light on one of the most fascinating aspects of early Eurasian contact. It suggests that for centuries, powerful states, positioned between East and West, had carefully controlled the flow of trade and information, preventing direct interaction between the Roman world and Han China. Yet, in one rare moment, that barrier may have been briefly crossed. According to this account, a group described as representatives of the Roman world arrived at the Han capital of Luoyang in the year 166. This journey was extraordinary in both distance and ambition. The visitors were said to have been sent by a Roman ruler, though the exact identity is uncertain. The timing points more convincingly to a later emperor from the same ruling family, rather than the one originally named in the record. What makes this episode especially remarkable is the route taken. Instead of travelling overland through Central Asia, where powerful empires controlled key passages, the delegation appears to have come by sea. Entering from the south, they passed through regions of Southeast Asia before reaching Chinese territory. The gifts they carried reflected this journey, including exotic items such as ivory and tortoise shells, likely acquired along maritime trade routes. This event is described as the first known instance of direct contact between the Roman world and China. If accurate, it represents a rare moment when the long-standing system of intermediaries was bypassed. For generations, the movement of goods and information between East and West had been managed by powerful Middle States, particularly those in Iran and Central Asia, who benefited greatly from controlling these exchanges. Across nearly 5 centuries, one of these intermediary powers maintained a dominant position in the heart of Eurasia. Rising from relatively modest beginnings, its rulers built a durable and influential empire that endured through shifting alliances, internal struggles, and repeated external threats. Their state became one of the great political forces of the ancient world, shaping the flow of commerce and culture across continents. Despite occasional wars, especially with Rome, this empire remained remarkably resilient. Internal disputes over succession were often intense, yet they did not prevent the state from continuing to function as a central link between distant regions. Its success was not based solely on military strength, but also on a clear understanding of the importance of trade. The ruling elite recognized that prosperity depended on maintaining the steady movement of goods across their territory. Relations with Eastern powers remained largely peaceful. There is little evidence of direct conflict with China, and interactions with neighbouring Central Asian states were often cooperative, rather than hostile. Trade, it seems, was too valuable to risk disruption through unnecessary warfare. Even in cases where tensions existed, economic interests tended to prevail. The relationship with Rome was more complex. At times, it was marked by open conflict, as both sides competed for influence over key border regions. Yet even here, commerce played a stabilizing role. Trade continued across political boundaries, and both empires understood that economic exchange was essential to their strength. Diplomatic efforts often aimed not only to avoid war, but also to ensure that trade routes remained open and profitable. There is even evidence of attempts to formalize this shared interest. At one point, a Roman ruler proposed cooperation based on mutual benefits in the exchange of valuable goods such as textiles and spices. This reflects a broader pattern in which economic considerations shaped political decisions, even between rival powers. In the end, the story of this period is not simply one of conflict between empires, but of connection. Vast distances were bridged by networks of trade that linked diverse cultures and regions. Goods travelled thousands of kilometres, but so did ideas, technologies, and beliefs. The empires that controlled these routes did more than govern territory. They facilitated a system that brought the ancient world closer together. Even as political tensions rose and fell, the flow of commerce continued to bind these regions into a shared economic space. The great powers of Eurasia, despite their differences, were deeply interconnected. Their fortunes were tied not only to conquest and control, but also to their ability to sustain and manage the exchange of wealth across continents. Over time, however, this system began to weaken. Internal instability, external pressures, and changing conditions gradually undermined the structures that had supported long-distance trade. By the early 3rd century, several of the major empires that had once dominated these networks began to decline or collapse. Yet the legacy of this era endured. The connections established during these centuries laid the foundation for future interactions between East and West. The roots, relationships, and shared experiences of this time continue to influence the course of history long after the original empires had disappeared. At the same time, further east, in the vast landscapes of Central Asia, another major power was rising. Positioned at the crossroads of important trade routes, this new empire would play a decisive role in maintaining and expanding the networks that connected distant civilizations. Its rulers would not only inherit the legacy of earlier powers, but also shape the next phase of Eurasian history in ways that would be felt for centuries to come. When Kanishka rose to power, the Kushan Empire entered its most remarkable and influential era. This period stands out as a turning point not only for Central Asia, but for the wider ancient world. Under his rule, the empire reached a level of strength, stability, and cultural richness that placed it among the great civilizations of its time. His reign marked the height of Kushan influence, a time when political control, economic power, and cultural exchange all came together at an extraordinary scale. Kanishka established a new system of dating his reign, marking the beginning of a distinct era that carried his name. For a long time, it was believed that this signaled the start of an entirely new royal line. However, later discoveries revealed something even more significant. His rule was not a break from the past, but a continuation of a powerful family lineage that stretched back generations. This long and uninterrupted succession created a rare sense of continuity, allowing the empire to function without the instability that often followed changes in leadership. Over more than 2 centuries, this stability became one of the key foundations of Kushan's success. During Kanishka's reign, the empire expanded further than ever before. Its influence stretched deep into northern India, and new regions were brought under control. This expansion was not only about territory, but also about strengthening the empire's position within the wider network of trade routes that connected distant civilizations. The eastern regions of the empire became increasingly important, with new administrative centers emerging far from the traditional heartland in Bactria. These developments show how the empire adapted and grew, integrating diverse regions into a single political structure. Accounts from later traditions describe powerful military campaigns that reinforced Kanishka's authority. These stories speak of victories in India and beyond, emphasizing the scale of his ambitions. While some of these narratives may exaggerate the details, they reflect a broader truth. Kanishka was seen as a ruler whose power extended across vast distances. At the same time, there is little reliable evidence of major conflict with neighbouring Central Asian powers, suggesting that diplomacy and shared economic interests often played a greater role than warfare in maintaining regional stability. Trade continued to flourish under Kanishka, and the empire's central position allowed it to benefit greatly from the movement of goods across Eurasia. This prosperity is clearly visible in the coinage of the period. Large numbers of gold and copper coins have been found across a wide geographic area, demonstrating both the reach of the empire and the strength of its economy. These coins were not only a means of exchange, but also a powerful symbol of royal authority. Kanishka introduced important changes to the design of these coins. His image was consistently shown performing a ritual at a fire altar, emphasizing both royal power and religious identity. On the reverse side, a wide variety of deities appeared, drawn from different cultural traditions. This reflects the diverse nature of the empire itself, where multiple beliefs and traditions coexisted. Over time, the inscriptions on the coins shifted to a language that was more widely understood across the region, making them more effective as tools of communication and control. Religion during this period presents a complex and fascinating picture. The imagery on the coins suggests a strong connection to Iranian religious traditions. Yet other sources describe Kanishka as a major supporter of Buddhism. This apparent contradiction reveals the flexible and inclusive nature of Kushan rule. Rather than promoting a single belief system, the empire seems to have embraced a range of religious practices, allowing different communities to maintain their traditions, while still remaining part of a unified state. Kanishka's support for Buddhism had far-reaching consequences. Under his patronage, religious institutions expanded and new places of worship were constructed across the empire. At the same time, efforts were made to standardize and preserve important religious teachings. Texts were translated into a more widely understood language, making them accessible to a broader audience. This played a crucial role in the spread of Buddhist ideas beyond their original homeland, carrying them across Central Asia and into East Asia. Art also flourished during this period, particularly in regions such as Gandhara and Mathura. These areas became centers of artistic innovation, producing sculptures that blended different cultural influences into entirely new forms. For the first time, the Buddha was represented in human form, marking a major shift in religious expression. These images combined elements from Greek, Iranian, and Indian traditions, creating a visual language that could be understood across cultures. The sculptures of Gandhara, carved from dark stone, often display strong influences from classical Mediterranean art. Figures are shown with detailed drapery and realistic features, reflecting a style that had travelled far from its original roots. In contrast, the art of Mathura developed its own distinctive character. Sculptures from this region are more robust and energetic, conveying strength and presence through their form. Together, these artistic traditions reveal the cultural richness of the Kushan world and the deep connections that linked different regions. After Kanishka, the empire continued under the rule of his successors. His immediate heir maintained the strength of the state for several decades, overseeing a long period of continuity. The coinage of this time shows an even greater variety of religious imagery, suggesting that the tradition of cultural diversity remained strong. Stability persisted, supported by the same structures that had been established during the earlier reigns. The final great ruler of this period inherited a still powerful empire, but subtle changes were beginning to appear. His coins suggest a stronger emphasis on South Asian religious traditions, hinting at shifts in cultural influence within the ruling elite. Whether this represents a change in policy or simply a reflection of the empire's diversity is difficult to determine. What is clear is that the Kushan world remained deeply interconnected, blending different traditions into a unique cultural identity. By the early 3rd century, however, the balance began to shift. New powers emerged on the edges of the empire, and external pressure increased. Attempts were made to form alliances to counter these threats, but they were not successful. Gradually, the structures that had supported Kushan dominance began to weaken. Even as political control declined, the legacy of this period endured. The networks of trade that passed through Kushan lands continued to shape the movement of goods and ideas long after the empire itself had faded. The cultural achievements of this era, from religious developments to artistic innovation, left a lasting imprint on regions far beyond Central Asia. Ancient writers from the Greek and Roman world often claimed that the seasonal monsoon winds were first understood by their own sailors. Some traditions speak of a navigator named Hippolos, who is said to have realized that ships no longer needed to cling to the coastline, but could instead cross the open sea by following predictable wind patterns. By studying the shape of the coastline and the position of key ports, he supposedly opened a faster and more direct route across the Arabian Sea. Other authors offered different names, suggesting that another Greek explorer had made the discovery while trading with India during the age of the Hellenistic kingdoms. There are even stories of merchants who stumbled upon these winds by accident after being blown far off course, only to survive and bring back knowledge of what they had encountered. Yet this narrative raises an obvious question. Long before Greek merchants entered these waters, sailors from India, Arabia, and Mesopotamia had already been navigating the Indian Ocean for thousands of years. Their ships carried goods across vast distances, linking distant shores through steady and reliable trade. It is difficult to imagine that such experienced mariners would not have understood the seasonal rhythm of the winds that shaped every voyage. The idea that this knowledge suddenly appeared only with the arrival of outsiders reflects more about later storytelling than historical reality. There are hints that local sailors already possessed this knowledge and may even have passed it on. One account describes a lone Indian sailor who survived a shipwreck and reached foreign shores. After learning the local language, he explained how he had drifted off course during a voyage from India and offered to guide others back along the same route. His experience suggests that the winds of the Indian Ocean were already familiar to those who had long lived and traded along its coasts. Rather than a sudden discovery, it is more likely that this knowledge developed gradually over generations, refined by observation and experience. Regardless of who first understood these winds, their impact was transformative. Once sailors began to use them with confidence, maritime trade expanded rapidly. Ships could now cross open waters instead of following slow and dangerous coastal paths. Travel became faster, more predictable, and far more efficient. During the first century of the Common Era, increasing numbers of foreign merchants began arriving at ports along the Indian coast. Their presence marked a new phase in long-distance trade, one that connected distant regions more closely than ever before. A detailed picture of this growing network comes from a practical guide written by a merchant familiar with these routes. This text describes the challenges of navigation, the nature of different harbours, and the goods that moved through them. It provides a glimpse into a world where merchants, sailors, and local rulers were all part of a vast system of exchange stretching across the Indian Ocean. The author was likely someone deeply involved in trade, possibly based in one of the major ports along the Red Sea, drawing on first-hand experience as well as reports from others. The document is organised into short sections, each focused on a particular location. It explains how to approach a harbour, what goods could be bought or sold there, and what political conditions might affect trade. Some ports are described clearly, while others remain uncertain due to limited detail. What stands out most is the sheer diversity of goods being transported. Exotic animals were shipped across the seas to be displayed in distant arenas. Spices, oils, fruits, and textiles travelled alongside precious materials such as pearls, silk, and dyed fabrics. These goods were not only valuable, but also highly desired in distant markets. Evidence from archaeology supports this picture. Large numbers of coins from the Mediterranean world have been found at coastal sites in India, especially those dating to the 1st and 2nd centuries. Their presence shows how deeply connected these regions had become. Yet this flow of wealth did not continue indefinitely. By the 3rd century, the number of such coins declines sharply, suggesting a slowdown in trade and a shift in the wider economic landscape. The expansion of maritime trade during this period was closely tied to political changes in the Mediterranean world. When Roman power extended into Egypt, control of key ports along the Red Sea passed into new hands. These ports were improved and expanded, allowing for greater movement of goods between Africa, Arabia, and India. Ships began to sail in larger numbers, carrying cargoes across long distances with increasing regularity. What had once been a limited and risky endeavour became a major economic system. The scale of this expansion is reflected in contemporary observations. Where only a few ships had once attempted the journey, now large fleets set sail each year. These vessels were similar to those used in the Mediterranean, capable of carrying heavy cargo across long distances. Some harbours were even designed to accommodate particularly large ships, suggesting that trade had reached an impressive level of organisation and volume. The ports that supported this trade became vital centres of activity. Some were located at the northern end of the Red Sea, connected to inland routes that led to major cities. Others were built further south, where navigation was easier and conditions more favourable. Over time, these southern ports grew in importance, serving as gateways between the Indian Ocean and the wider Roman world. Roads were constructed to link them with inland regions, ensuring that goods could move efficiently from ships to markets and back again. Archaeological discoveries at these sites reveal just how diverse the connections were. Objects from distant lands appear side by side, showing that merchants and sailors from different cultures were living and working together. Inscriptions in unfamiliar scripts, fragments of foreign pottery, and remains of imported goods all point to a world where cultural boundaries were constantly crossed. Some materials were even reused in everyday construction, suggesting that trade goods were not only valuable, but also practical resources. The ships that left these ports carried more than just precious metals. They transported a wide range of products, including wine, crafted goods, and luxury items. These were exchanged for equally valuable commodities from South Asia, creating a balanced flow of trade. Archaeological finds show that these imports were highly valued, appearing in settlements far from the coast. The presence of such goods reflects both wealth and the desire for objects associated with distant lands. Along the Indian coastline, several key ports played central roles in this network. Some were located near river mouths, allowing goods to move easily between inland regions and the sea. Others were situated in areas known for specific products such as spices or textiles. These ports acted as hubs where merchants gathered, exchanged goods, and prepared for long voyages. The movement of ships followed a seasonal rhythm, timed carefully to match the changing winds. Connections between inland empires and coastal trade routes were also essential. Goods produced far from the sea were transported along rivers and overland routes to reach the ports. From there, they were loaded onto ships and carried across the ocean. This system linked distant regions into a single network, where products from one part of the world could travel thousands of kilometers to reach another. Transport by sea offered clear advantages over land routes. It was faster, cheaper, and capable of moving larger quantities of goods. Once traders had navigated the difficult mountain routes of Central Asia, sending goods downriver and out to sea became the most efficient option. This combination of land and maritime transport created a powerful system that supported large-scale exchange. Financial arrangements behind this trade were equally impressive. Documents from the period reveal contracts involving enormous sums of money, showing just how valuable these goods were. A single shipment could be worth a fortune, reflecting both the rarity of the items and the demand for them in distant markets. Such transactions required significant capital, often provided by wealthy investors or financial institutions. Coins played a central role in facilitating this exchange. Large numbers of gold and silver coins have been discovered across the Indian subcontinent, indicating the scale of economic interaction. These coins were not only used for trade, but also became part of local economies, further integrating distant regions into a shared system. The Arabian Peninsula also played a crucial role in this network. Ports along its coasts connected maritime routes with overland trade paths, leading deep into the interior. Goods such as incense travelled across deserts to reach coastal markets where they were shipped to distant lands. These routes were carefully managed and often controlled by powerful local groups who benefited from the flow of trade. Despite attempts by larger empires to dominate these regions, many of these trading centres remained independent. Their wealth and strategic importance made them difficult to control, and local merchants continued to play a key role in maintaining the flow of goods. The result was a complex and dynamic system where power, trade, and geography were closely intertwined. Maritime trade in the Indian Ocean was never limited to the famous ports along the Red Sea or the western coast of India. Another critical zone of activity existed further east, at the head of the Persian Gulf, where powerful kingdoms and trading cities controlled the flow of goods between sea routes and inland empires. Among these, the Parthians played a decisive role. By extending their influence down to the northern Gulf, they secured access to vital trade centres and positioned themselves as intermediaries between East and West. Their control was so strategic that they even discouraged foreign envoys from continuing westward, ensuring that commerce remained dependent on their networks. At the same time, merchant communities from cities deep within the desert also became key players in this system. Traders from Palmyra were especially active, linking caravan routes with maritime trade. Their reach extended from inland Syria all the way to ports near the mouth of the Indus River. These merchants were not simply middlemen, they organised expeditions, transported luxury goods, such as pearls and spices, and connected distant markets through both land and sea. Their presence demonstrates how interconnected the trade system had become, stretching across deserts, rivers, and oceans. The ports of the Persian Gulf themselves were often modest in size, but they served an essential purpose. Rather than acting as final destinations, they functioned as transfer points, where cargo was unloaded, reorganized, and sent inland. Geography made this process necessary. The coastline of the Gulf has always been unstable, shaped by shifting sediments and changing water levels. Many ports were located far inland along river systems, requiring goods to be transferred onto smaller vessels to complete the journey. This added complexity to trade, but did not diminish its importance. Despite these challenges, one major centre consistently dominated the region. The city of Charax-Spasinu became the primary gateway between the Persian Gulf and the great river valleys of Mesopotamia. Unlike coastal ports, it stood inland along a river, connected to the sea through a smaller harbour known as a polygos. This arrangement allowed goods arriving by ship to move efficiently into the heart of the Near East, linking maritime routes with overland trade networks that stretched toward the Mediterranean and beyond. The origins of Charax trace back to the era of Alexander the Great, who founded the settlement to support trade with his eastern territories. Over time, the city evolved through destruction and rebuilding, shaped by floods and political change. Under local rulers, and later under Parthian control, it grew into a thriving commercial hub. Even when empires shifted and authority changed hands, the city's role as a centre of exchange remained constant, sustained by the steady movement of goods through its markets. Trade routes, connecting the Persian Gulf, followed predictable patterns. ships moved between ports such as Apologos and others further south before continuing toward India. These routes formed a stable corridor where merchants, often of Arab or Persian origin, operated regularly. Goods, such as frankincense, textiles, and precious materials circulated through this system, moving not only across the sea, but also deep into inland regions. From the Gulf, caravans carried these products towards cities, like Petra and Gaza, where they entered the wider markets of the Mediterranean world. Overland connections strengthened the importance of these ports even further. Roads linked the Gulf to major desert cities, creating a network that allowed goods to flow in multiple directions. New routes emerged over time, connecting previously distant regions and increasing the speed and volume of trade. These developments show that maritime commerce was never isolated. It depended on a complex system of inland transport and regional cooperation. Beyond the Persian Gulf, the eastern side of the Indian Ocean was also becoming increasingly connected. Early Chinese states had limited involvement in maritime trade, largely due to geographical barriers and internal priorities. However, even in these early periods, indirect connections existed. Objects such as cowrie shells, originating from islands far to the south, found their way into Chinese regions through a combination of sea travel and overland exchange. These items were valued for decoration and ritual use, hinting at early links between distant cultures. As Chinese power expanded southward, these connections grew stronger. Coastal regions became more integrated into wider trade networks, and new states emerged along the southern frontier. These areas developed active maritime links with Southeast Asia, creating pathways that eventually connected to the Indian Ocean. Merchants travelled along coastlines, stopping at multiple ports and gradually extending their reach further west. Archaeological discoveries reveal the extent of these interactions. Elite tombs in southern China contain objects that clearly originated far beyond the region. Items such as pearls, glass ornaments, ivory, and exotic materials demonstrate that long-distance trade had reached even the highest levels of society. These goods were not only symbols of wealth, but also evidence of a growing network that linked China to distant parts of Asia and beyond. Written sources from the period describe southern Chinese ports as thriving centers of commerce. Among them, Guangzhou stands out as a place where wealth accumulated through trade with foreign merchants. The influence of this commerce extended beyond the ports themselves, affecting agriculture, production, and daily life in surrounding regions. Inland communities became increasingly connected to coastal trade, supplying goods and benefiting from the flow of wealth. There were also connections between China and the Indian subcontinent through both land and sea routes. Merchants and envoys travelled across Central Asia, while others followed maritime paths through Southeast Asia. These journeys were not always official diplomatic missions. Many were driven by commerce, with traders presenting themselves as envoys in order to gain access to foreign markets. This blending of trade and diplomacy highlights the practical realities of long-distance exchange. Knowledge of distant lands, however, remained limited. Descriptions of China in foreign accounts often contain inaccuracies, reflecting the immense distances involved and the reliance on second-hand information. Even so, there was a clear understanding that silk and other valuable goods originated from a far eastern land and travelled through multiple regions before reaching Western markets. This awareness alone demonstrates how interconnected these societies had become. Despite the growth of maritime routes, land-based trade continued to play a dominant role in connecting China with the West during this period. Goods often moved from inland Chinese centres across Central Asia before reaching the Indus Valley and eventually the sea. Only later would maritime routes become the primary channel for this exchange. Even after the western half of the Roman world began to fragment in the 5th century, the eastern provinces did not collapse. Instead, they adapted, reorganized, and grew stronger, eventually transforming into what is now known as the Byzantine Empire. By the late 6th century, two great powers stood at the height of their strength: the Byzantine state in the west and the Sasanian Empire in the east. At the same time, China had recovered from earlier turmoil and was once again unified under a powerful dynasty. Although earlier centuries had witnessed the fall of major empires and widespread instability, much of Eurasia had, by this point, reassembled into a new balance of power dominated by a few strong civilizations. This balance extended beyond the major empires themselves. Smaller groups and emerging societies positioned themselves alongside these dominant powers, often forming alliances or acting as intermediaries. Arab tribes, for example, became closely tied to both the Byzantine and Sasanian worlds, serving as clients and playing a strategic role along frontier regions. Meanwhile, nomadic groups from the Eurasian steppes gradually began to settle and form their own states, at times aligning themselves with one empire or another, depending on shifting political circumstances. Together, these relationships created a complex and interconnected system that linked vast regions of Eurasia into a single geopolitical framework. However, this fragile balance did not endure for long. The Sasanian Empire, despite its strength, entered a period of rapid decline in the early 7th century. Internal instability, economic strain, and prolonged wars weakened the state at a critical moment. Into this environment came a new and dynamic force: Arab armies unified under the banner of Islam. Their expansion began at a time when the Sasanian system was already faltering. Key cities fell one after another, including the imperial capital, and decisive battles shattered the remaining resistance. Within a few decades, a political order that had dominated the region for centuries disappeared, replaced by a new and rapidly expanding Islamic world. Despite its fall, the legacy of the Sasanian Empire did not vanish. Its administrative systems, cultural traditions, and models of governance were absorbed and adapted by the new rulers of the region. In this way, Persian influence continued to shape political life across the Middle East and beyond for centuries. More broadly, Iranian civilizations had long served as a bridge between East and West, connecting distant regions through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. This role did not end with the fall of the Sasanians. Instead, it carried forward into the next era under new forms. While these transformations were unfolding in the East, the Roman world was experiencing its own period of crisis. In the 3rd century, the empire faced a combination of internal instability and external pressure that threatened its survival. Political authority weakened as emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, often elevated by military support and removed just as quickly. Civil wars became frequent, and rival leaders competed for control across different regions. At the same time, foreign groups pushed against the empire's borders, testing its defences and exploiting its internal divisions. This period of turmoil brought profound economic challenges. Trade networks that had once connected distant regions began to break down, and the stability that had supported long-distance commerce weakened. Currency lost value, prices rose, and many economic transactions shifted away from money toward direct exchange of goods. Urban centres, once vibrant hubs of trade and administration, struggled to maintain their populations and infrastructure. In response, large estates became increasingly self-sufficient, producing what they needed locally rather than relying on distant markets. Social structures also began to change. Many individuals sought protection and stability by attaching themselves to powerful landowners, giving rise to new forms of dependency. These developments marked the early stages of transformations that would later define medieval society in Europe. Yet these changes were not uniform across the empire. Some regions remained prosperous, and in certain areas, economic activity continued with little interruption. Rather than a complete collapse, this period can be understood as a time of uneven transformation, where instability in some regions coexisted with resilience in others. At the same time, the disruption of long-distance trade had wider consequences. The interconnected networks that had once linked the Mediterranean, Central Asia, and East Asia were severely weakened. With major empires collapsing or facing internal crises, the infrastructure that supported large-scale exchange began to fragment. The flow of goods slowed, and the once vibrant connections across Eurasia diminished significantly. Yet these same networks had done more than move goods. They had also carried ideas, beliefs, and cultural practices across vast distances. Religions in particular spread along these routes, reaching new populations and reshaping societies. Among the most influential was Buddhism, which had originated in northern India centuries earlier. Over time, it moved outward along trade routes, carried by merchants, monks, and travelers. By the first centuries of the Common Era, Buddhist teachings had reached Central Asia and begun to enter China. At first, the new ideas encountered resistance, especially from established traditions. However, as political instability increased and traditional systems struggled to provide answers, many people became more open to alternative beliefs. Buddhism offered a vision that appealed across social boundaries, promising spiritual fulfillment regardless of status or background. Its spread accelerated during periods of uncertainty, when people sought new forms of meaning and stability. Adapting these teachings to local cultures was not always easy. Translators and scholars worked to express unfamiliar concepts in ways that could be understood within existing traditions. Over time, this process led to the development of distinct forms of Buddhism shaped by local influences. Monasteries, temples, and artistic traditions began to appear across China, transforming both the physical and cultural landscape. At the same time, other belief systems were also evolving and spreading. Christianity, which had emerged within the Roman world, expanded steadily despite early opposition. Missionaries travelled extensively, using established roads and trade routes to reach distant communities. Their message attracted followers across different regions, and over time, Christian communities became firmly established throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Eventually, imperial support allowed the religion to grow even further, becoming a central part of the Roman world. Further east, variations of Christianity developed along different lines, adapting to new cultural environments. Some groups moved along trade routes into Central Asia and beyond, establishing communities far from their original centres. This movement highlights the role of trade networks not only in economic exchange but also in the spread of religious ideas. In Iran and Central Asia, Zoroastrianism remained a dominant spiritual force for centuries. Supported by imperial authority, it shaped both religious life and political ideology. Its teachings influenced neighbouring traditions and contributed to the broader exchange of ideas across the region. At the same time, new belief systems such as Manichaeism emerged, blending elements from multiple traditions into a single framework. These religions spread widely along trade routes, particularly among merchants who moved between different cultural worlds. Maritime connections also played a crucial role in the spread of religious ideas. Across Southeast Asia, contact with Indian traders introduced new cultural and spiritual influences. Local rulers adopted elements of Indian traditions, incorporating them into their own systems of governance and belief. Over time, these influences blended with existing practices, creating unique cultural landscapes shaped by both local and foreign elements. The movement of ideas, however, was not the only consequence of increased connectivity. Diseases also travelled along these same routes, often with devastating effects. Populations that had no prior exposure to certain illnesses were especially vulnerable, and outbreaks could spread rapidly across regions connected by trade. Epidemics struck both the Roman and Chinese worlds during this period, contributing to social and political instability. One major outbreak in the Roman Empire caused widespread mortality, affecting both cities and military forces. Contemporary observers described symptoms consistent with highly contagious diseases, and the scale of the impact suggests significant population loss. Around the same time, similar outbreaks appear to have occurred in East Asia, indicating that these epidemics may have been linked through long-distance connections. Another devastating wave of disease followed in the 3rd century, spreading across large parts of the Roman world. It disrupted daily life, weakened armies, and placed additional strain on already fragile systems. The psychological impact was equally profound, as communities struggled to understand and respond to the crisis. Different groups reacted in different ways, with some interpreting the events through religious frameworks. Taken together, these developments reveal both the strength and vulnerability of interconnected systems. The same networks that enabled the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture also allowed instability to spread. Political collapse, economic disruption, and disease were not isolated events, but part of a broader pattern affecting multiple regions at once.